Advisor. Many are on a quest to make America great again. When asked by pollsters, most Americans say that America was greatest during their childhood years. If you were a child in the 60s, that's likely true. Stacey?
Exactly. We have some headlines regarding how America is basically downgraded. It's no longer AAA. The first headline: low oil prices and high dividends cost ExxonMobil its sterling AAA credit rating. For the first time since the Great Depression, ExxonMobil has a less than perfect credit rating. So now in the United States, there are only two non-financial corporations with a AAA rating: Microsoft and Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've talked about this degradation in the ratings of corporate debt and sovereign debt. There are fewer and fewer sovereigns with AAA rating as well. That's very important because in a highly leveraged world like we have today, the bedrock is on AAA rated paper for the collateral. And what we've seen over the years is that that collateral has been degraded through these series of downgrades by the rating agencies. And to compensate for that, the Bank of International Settlements and other organizations have reduced the requirement for banks and countries to keep AAA rated paper on their books. So they've enabled this trend, this drift toward the putrefaction of the global financial collateral. And it's the end times, isn't it? It's the beginning of collapse.
Well, in terms of this whole notion of make America great again that is gripping America, this notion that we need to be great again and we're no longer great, here's a chart, and I took this from QZ.com, or QZ.com as they might say in the United Kingdom, the number of AAA rated non-financial companies in the US. See, this goes back to the mid-1980s when the whole Big Bang, they called it, the financialization, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and the financialization of the world. You know, corporations used to not have so much leverage, and now just like the citizens of an economy, the corporations, you see their leverage increasing, their ratings plummet, and since 2000, we're just basically down to almost zero.
Well, let me explain, just draw a simple line on this chart here, there. So I can explain this very simply here. We have the predator parasites, and here we have the hosts. And during this period of time, the parasites have sucked out all the equity and AAA ratings of the host because we have a parasitical relationship between the financial sector and the rest of the world. Why would a bank have a AAA rating if all of their clients have triple B or lower ratings or junk rating? The junk bond market is exploding. Unless, of course, they were highly corrupt and buying those ratings from Moody's, for example, caught in a cash for rating scandal.
Well, this is Moody's, and of course, yeah, they were caught. Moody's? Yeah, it's Moody's. Moody's who rated ExxonMobil AA+. So here, again, the reason why ExxonMobil, they have a fairly simple business. They find oil, they pump oil, and they sell the oil, right? Well, the reason why they've been downgraded, according to Moody's, the company's debt level has more than doubled in recent years, reflecting high capital spending on major projects in a high commodity price environment, and dividends and share repurchases that substantially exceeded internally generated cash flow. So this is the new fangled thing, of course, at the end times of, I guess, when America's no longer great, of just consuming and buying back your shares. The capital expenditure, of course, the high capital expenditure was a plus for the U.S. economy. It was generating a lot of good jobs, well-paying jobs, the only CapEx in the whole United States of America. Everything else, all other revenues went to share buybacks, except for in the oil sector. And this is why we see the now collapse of the economy.
Well, it brings in a phrase you haven't heard about recently, peak oil, which hasn't been talked about because there's been the so-called flood of oil into the market. But when you say that Exxon's CapEx doubles, it's because the availability of oil at a certain price is gone. The first trillion barrels of oil that was sucked out of the crust of the earth has now been sucked out. And the remaining trillion barrels will cost a lot more to suck out because they are in places that are hard to get to or very expensive to get to. Thus, CapEx is going higher. Thus, Exxon's rating is being downgraded. Simultaneously, there are other geopolitical influences that have created a flood of oil in the market and the prices come down. That's true. But that idea of peak oil, which is that the end of cheaply processed, extracted oil, this is evidence of it.
And another issue that has emerged in America of why America is no longer great is the trade deals and the so-called free trade deals. It started with NAFTA, then we had the opening up of China, and now we have these other trade deals, TPP and TTIP, that are being negotiated and are big issues on both sides of the aisle, really. Donald Trump is always talking about these trade deals and how they're bad trade deals and America's lose jobs. Well, here in the United Kingdom, there is actually the United Kingdom government, their own research found that it's also TTIP is a bad deal. The headline reads, TTIP, UK government found trade deal had lots of risks and no benefit in its only assessment. Stark warning against agreement disclosed in response to a Freedom of Information request. They got this information from the Department of Business and Innovation, and what it found is that the Department of Business and Innovation had basically contracted the London School of Economics to do some research and to look at this TTIP deal and see whether or not, or how much. They were, of course, hoping that they would be able to say this would benefit the UK economy by $50 quadrillion. But it said, all in all, it is doubtful UK investors will find additional protections from an EU-US investment protection treaty beyond those currently provided and enforced under US law. Ultimately, we conclude that an EU-US investment treaty that does contain ISDS is likely to have few or no benefits to the UK while having meaningful economic and political costs, the report said.
ISDS?
The investor-state dispute settlements, so the separate judicial system for corporations who could sue nations, so they could sue the United Kingdom because they have a privatized a public NHS. So they could say, this is harming our profits, we're going to sue you for the $1 trillion we could have sued for, we could have made by selling health insurance to this country, and we could sue you.
Okay, so that so-called free trade deal is anti-competitive.
This is what their own internal study showed. They, of course, never released this, nor did they ever highlight it, nor did they tell the population that this is the advice that they received. They continue, of course, the Bank of International Settlements, the Department of Business and Innovation says that it's a great deal. And in fact, they pointed out that the BIS said that it boosts the economy by £10 billion a year. So this is an over like $1.4 trillion pound economy. It was interesting in this article, there was in the comments section, a guy named Grindelow said, since 2009, the richest 1% have taken around 95% of all newly created growth or income. And now let's assume the 1% have gone soft in the head and are only taking 90% of growth. 10% of £10 billion is £1 billion. This is shared by the 99%, i.e. 60 million in the UK. So our share is £16 each before tax.
Right, and the fee, though, on that deal for those cutting the deal is enormous. The multi-million-pound fees to cut the deal. It's non-transparent because they did not share this information with the people who it impacts the most, and it's non-competitive. It says clearly in the report that all this deal does is it protects monopoly positions and it destroys competition. And without competition, you can't have a vibrant economy, and without a vibrant economy, you have a dictatorship and a tyrannical oligarch system.
Well, we do have an oligarch system, and the notion that all of this 10 billion pounds for the economy, and this guy who in the comment section is quite right, because we have a situation where most of the gains since the financial crisis have gone to the top. So what is to say that the secret trade deal that nobody's allowed to look at, including MEPs like Luke Ming, Flanagan, who we had on our show, they're not allowed to look at the deal. So we don't even know where this 10 billion pound pot of money is going to go to. Which oligarchs is it going to go to? Presumably
the
not
analysis
the
that needs to be made is that although there's a possibility that consumer products will be cheaper, the fact is that the hourly wage for workers will be down at a greater percentage than what you're saving on these consumer goods that you think you're going to get cheaper. Net, it's a horrible downward sliding slope into poverty, guaranteed. by a deal that gives sovereign rights, ultra sovereign rights, supranational sovereign rights to a trade body that answers only to their own definition of freedom and democracy, which means you're a serf living on their trade plantation. Okay? If that's what you want, that's what you get.
And of course, you know, before there was this notion that we have to make America great again, there was make Britain great again, because of course they were a massive empire with actual infrastructure all around the world. America's like a virtual empire with just a few little military bases all around the world. So here we have an economy where you could see where you could see the trajectory of the U.S., where the U.S. will eventually go after all these trade deals have sent all their jobs overseas. Is here they don't. The one plant still making steel is about to be shuttered. They seem to be having a difficult time negotiating a deal to keep it open. Yeah,
why would they not come to some kind of resolution for the local steel plant as a priority over a non-transparent, invisible trade deal written by foreign interests for foreign interests? That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, one would ask such a question if one were concerned about the business and goings-on here in Great Britain. Make Britain great again. Make America great again. Well, alas, I don't think that will happen with these trade deals. The problem is that so much of it is secret. On the surface, we're all like, okay, why are you doing that? I am into this idea of greatness. What will bring it back? What will restore the greatness to America, to Britain? Anywhere, is there any greatness out there? Where are the great thinkers? Well, the great doers? The great doers, somebody made this is a handmade in Britain, your vest that you wear every day. That's right, Tom Baker in Soho made this vest. I designed it, by the way. These are the buttons, the stripes, everything I designed. That's like an apple designed in America, made in Britain. It's beautiful. But my thought that I was continuing on was that these secret trade deals on the surface, of course, we're all for free trade. You want to be able to trade with anybody around the world. You want to be able to trade frictionlessly, efficiently. And yet, what these trade deals are really gumming up free trade. They're actually all sorts of toll booths entered. These are really toll booth deals. Right. This is what we need to establish. That's why America is no longer great. That's why the UK is no longer great. That's why Europe is no longer great. It's because there are so many toll booths. Too many toll booths. Not enough cars. All right, well, we got to go. So thank you. USA, USA, USA. USA? No USA. No essay. Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Jim Rickards, author of The New Case for Gold. Jim, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Great to be with you.
This book is burning up the charts all over the world. Everyone's talking about it, and rightfully so. It's a fantastic book. So let's just get right into it, Jim Rickards. Before we talk about the new arguments for gold, let's talk about the old arguments and put these to rest. These are, as you've described, this is somewhat of a manifesto, which can be used to jujitsu, all those paper bugs, as we call them. The first one being there's not enough gold. You write, the objection to gold based on mining output is not that it stands in the way of growth, but that it stands in the way of theft. Elaborate.
Correct. Well, first of all, when people say there's not the gold supply doesn't grow fast enough to support the world economy. So the world economy grows maybe 3-4% a year. Mining output is, say, 1.6% a year, which is approximately what it is. So obviously gold can't keep up. That's nonsense. It's completely irrelevant because it fails to distinguish between official gold, that's the gold held by central banks and finance ministries, and total gold, which includes all the watches and jewelry and all the other gold in private hands. So if central banks want to expand the money supply on a gold standard, all they have to do is buy private gold, print money and buy gold. It's just like, it's where they print money today. They print money and buy bonds. All you have to do is print money and buy gold.
Right, there's something like 30,000 tons in the central bank system.
30,000 tons approximately of official gold.
And there's 170,000 tons above ground?
So mining output is irrelevant. irrelevant to official gold. Just go buy some private gold. But it's a good example, Max, of these arguments. I call them robo-reflex responses, where if you say something good about gold, somebody says, oh, the gold supply doesn't grow fast enough. People don't know what they're talking about. They're talking about mining output, which is irrelevant for the reason we just mentioned. So in the introduction of the book, I just go through a list of these supposedly, killer arguments against gold. None of them hold water. They're either factually incorrect or analytically incorrect. I just shoot those down.
Let's talk about why people have those robo-arguments. I'm going to go off-piste now
Sure.
to deviate from the script, but there is a group of paper bugs. There's an entrenched mentality that supports the current system, and gold is an enemy of the current system.
Right.
Any challenge to the current system based on debt, based on money printing, is rejected as a point of survival, not as a point of good economics.
Correct. I would say what you call the paper bugs or the anti-gold crowd, they fall into two categories. There are those who actually know better, who understand the arguments I make in the book, but they prefer the system as it is. The PhD economists, the central bankers. Look, if you had a monopoly on printing money, why would you want a gold standard? Why would you want to give up that much power? So Janet Yellen, Mario Draghi, Kuroda, the Bank of Japan, they control the money supply, and it's well known. If you control money, you control politics, you control behavior, you control a lot of other things. Why would you give up that power? Nobody gives up that kind of power voluntarily. So they actually know better, but they won't admit it. As for the vast majority of everyday citizens around the world, they accept these arguments at face value uncritically. I'm not disparaging people. I'm just saying that some people kind of don't know any better. They trust the elites. Others maybe not so trusting, but they don't think hard enough about it. But the point is, all these anti-gold arguments don't hold up.
Okay, let's talk about famous paper bugs. Here's Warren Buffett. He says he doesn't invest in gold because it has no yield.
Right. Buffett is worth, whatever, $60, $70 billion, supposedly based on his analytical acumen looking for value. The truth is, most of Warren Buffett's fortune comes from tax-deferred compounding. And he's right. Find something that you can compound. Don't pay taxes on it. This is why he buys insurance companies, because they have certain tax benefits that other companies don't have. Tax-deferred compounding is an incredibly powerful way to accumulate wealth.
Einstein called it the most powerful force in the universe.
Correct. Greater than gravity, or the other force is speed of light. The other force is Einstein was studying. So I understand that critique coming from Buffett, but here's the point. He says gold has no yield. It's not supposed to have a yield. It's money. Reach in your wallet, or woman reach in her purse, pull out a dollar bill or pound sterling and hold it up in front of you. Does it have a yield? No, it has no yield because it's money. And people say, well, I can get yield by putting it in the bank. Well, sure, but it's not money anymore. When you put your money in the bank, it's not money. It's an unsecured liability of an occasionally insolvent financial institution. I'm not saying pull your money out of the bank. I'm just saying understand what you're doing. It's not money anymore. You're taking the risk of the bank being solvent, or the bank not being closed, the regulators not shutting down the bank. You get a little bit of yield, a little bit of risk. You can get more yield by taking more risk. If you want yield, you take risk. Money doesn't have any risk. It's just money. Now, the risk is that people lose confidence in it. That's different. But gold's not supposed to have a yield. It's money.
Explain this to me, because this one I never understood at all. Maybe you can help me, enlighten me as to where this comes from. People talk about gold not having any intrinsic value.
Right.
Right. I mean, how does this happen?
Well, this is Marxian economics, which was long ago discredited by Carl Menger, among others. So here's the point. This goes back to David Ricardo. David Ricardo came up with the labor theory of value, because the economic question was, well, how do we determine the value for something? So Ricardo said, well, figure out the labor and the capital that went into it. What were the inputs, and that's the intrinsic value. Marx took that a step further with what's called the surplus theory of labor. What he said was, yes, I buy the intrinsic value, but labor is not getting its fair share. Labor is exploited by capital, so there's a labor input, but they don't get paid what they should because other people control the means of production, and they siphon off the surplus. So that's the exploitation of labor. So that's Ricardian economics and Marxian economics. But Carl Menger came along in 1871 and said, all that intrinsic theory is nonsense. That the way we value things is subjectively, through utility. What's the utility of something to you or me? That's how we value it. So the way to think about the value of gold is not the intrinsic value, which I guess would be the mining costs, et cetera, but how does gold perform as money? So in a world of really good policy, central bank policy, structural changes, lower taxes, sound money, maybe you would trust paper money and gold would not be particularly interesting. But none of those things are true. We have taxes are too high. Structural problems abound. Central banks don't understand economics, for that matter. So we're losing confidence in paper money, which means you would gain confidence in a different form of money. So gold's just a different form of money.
Okay, to that point, let me quote from this excellent book. If you see this wherever you go in your travels, pick it up immediately and buy some for your friends. They'll thank you for it. Now, the confidence, it says right here on page 27, Jim, the confidence of the entire global financial system rests on the U.S. dollar. Confidence in the dollar rests on the solvency of the Fed balance sheet, the Federal Reserve Bank, and that solvency rests on a sliver of gold. What's going on here?
Well, this goes back to a dinner I had with one of the members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and I had, my background, actually long before I got interested in gold, but my background was in the bond market, and I had actually taken the Fed's portfolio and marked it to market because if you buy bonds at 1.5% yield and interest rates go up to 2%, well, your bond is worth less on a mark-to-market basis, just the bond prices move inversely to interest rates. So I marked the Fed's balance sheet to market using available information, and I found that they were insolvent from time to time, not all the time. And I thought, well, that's a striking thing. The Federal Reserve is an insolvent bank on a mark-to-market basis. So I asked this member of the Board of Governors, and she said, no, we're not. And I said, well, I think you are. And she goes, no one's done that math. I said, I've done it, and I think others have done it. And then she finally harumphed and said, well, maybe, but it doesn't matter. And her view was, it doesn't matter if a central bank is insolvent. I thought, well, maybe it does, and maybe that'll be a political issue at the end of the day. But then I had a separate conversation with a real Fed insider, and I talk about this guy in the book, handpicked by Ben Bernanke for certain tasks, and he was adamant that they were never insolvent, even if you mark the bonds to market. And I thought, well, and he wouldn't budge on that. I said, well, maybe I'm missing something. And I went back to the Fed balance sheet, and having spent all this time on the bond portfolio, I said, lo and behold, they have this gold certificate that they valued at $42 an ounce. So I divided the face value by the $42, came up with the ounces converted to tons, and lo and behold, it was 8,000 tons, which is about how much the Treasury has. And the Treasury got the gold from confiscating it from the Fed and giving them the certificate in exchange. So this told me two things. Number one, the Treasury can't sell any more gold because they need that amount to back up the certificate on the Fed balance sheet. And then if you take the Fed line item and mark it to market, it adds about $350 billion to the Fed's capital. Takes their leverage right now is 113 to 1. They look like a really bad hedge fund, down to 13 to 1, which is normal leverage for a bank. So the point is, the Fed's hidden asset is not in the bond portfolio; it's in the gold portfolio.
So your research, the discovery and the research, essentially, and you walk through your process of discovery, if you will, the meetings you took, the anecdotal evidence, is that the Fed has a claim on Fort Knox.
Well, the Fed has a certificate which they got from the Treasury, which took the gold. And this goes back to 1934. Now remember, the Treasury is the government, the Fed is privately owned. Under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the government cannot take private property without just compensation. So when the Treasury took the Fed's gold, which they did, they gave them this gold certificate. Now, it's not a title to gold, but there's at least a moral, ethical obligation, if not a more binding legal obligation, because if the Treasury doesn't hang on to the gold to back up the certificate, have they violated the Fifth Amendment? Arguably, yes. But leaving that aside, the certificate is there, and when you mark that to market, you find that the Fed's capital is actually sound, but not because of the bonds, but because of the gold.
Right. So this brings up, of course, people are always asking, let's audit the Fed, let's audit Fort Knox.
Right.
Those questions are often asked.
Correct.
Now, what you're describing here is through the decades of legal machinations between the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and Congress, and the people, and the confiscation in the 30s, and we end up in a system today where, if you go through the paper trail, we know a few things. First of all, let's start with Fort Knox. Is the gold there?
The gold is there. I have good reason to believe it's there. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this. Is some of the gold leased? Almost certainly. So I don't dispute the fact that the gold is leased out and that the leasing is a paper operation designed to suppress and manipulate the price. So not only do I agree with that, there's very good evidence that that's the case, and I talk about that in the book. So I do agree with that. But the physical gold is there. Look, if you had that much gold, why would you let it out of your sight? And you don't have to. The notion that J.P. Morgan, through the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, Morgan's leases Treasury gold. It doesn't mean that J.P. Morgan has to back up a truck and take the gold away. It can be done with rights of hypothecation and paper transactions. So is it leased? Is it used to suppress prices? Yes. But that doesn't mean it's not there, and I have good reason to believe it is there. Now, having said that, I do favor an audit. I'm not against the audit. Open the doors, bring in members of the press and members of Congress and some everyday Americans and let them see the gold and do a register and write down the bar numbers and weigh them. I'm all in favor of that.
Last time you were here, you talked about this idea of, the U.S. is holding gold for other countries. If there was a conflict,
we'll just confiscate it.
They can easily just confiscate the
gold.
gold.
The U.S. is the king of confiscation. That's how we got Bear Asthma. We took it from the Germans in World War I.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. is very good at freezing and seizing assets.
And meanwhile, since we've talked about this, Germany and other countries have sought to repatriate their gold.
I first mentioned this in my first book, Currency Wars, in 2011.
Yes.
And actually
we're out of time. You know what? Can you stay for another segment?
I can.
Okay, stay right there. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Jim Rickards, author of this exciting new book, The New Case for Gold. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.